Dorian Yates was broke. He had a wife, a young son, and a rented flat in one of Birmingham's harder neighborhoods. He was training on a level of conviction that hadn't yet produced financial results, sustained by a belief in where the sport could take him that nothing in his circumstances had confirmed. In the early 1990s, a man approached him with a contract. The offer was 6 figures, guaranteed. It came not from a stranger, but from Tom Platz, one of the most respected and recognizable figures in professional bodybuilding. Yates turned it down. What followed was one of the defining careers in the history of the sport. The scale of what Vince McMahon was attempting in 1990 is worth understanding, because it establishes how significant the WBF offer actually was. This was not a modest rival organization offering competitive but reasonable contracts. McMahon had built the World Wrestling Federation into a global entertainment business, and he had identified professional bodybuilding as his next expansion target. He had been moving in that direction for some time. Through his company Titan Sports, he launched a publication called Bodybuilding Lifestyles, with Tom Platz involved as a recognizable figure from the fitness world. The logic was straightforward. McMahon was drawn to spectacle, and competitive bodybuilding was fundamentally a visual spectacle. He saw a sport operating conservatively, modest prize money, minimal television presence, no entertainment infrastructure. He saw an opening. At the closing ceremonies of the 1990 Mr. Olympia on IFBB grounds, in front of IFBB competitors and officials, Tom Platz took the stage as a representative of bodybuilding lifestyles. Standing in that room, he announced the formation of the World Bodybuilding Federation, and stated that the WBF intended to compete directly with the IFBB, and in his words, kick the IFBB's ass. At their own event, in their own building, McMahon's model for the WBF was built on a specific premise. Bodybuilders would function as entertainers. They would carry ring names, personas constructed for a wrestling-oriented audience. They would record promotional segments. They would have entrance production. Competitions would include entertainment rounds, in which athletes performed their characters live on stage. At the 1991 WBF Championship, Eddie Major Guns Robinson discharged a blank-loaded machine gun at Ninja's stage throughout the theater. Danny Padilla performed a Jack and the Beanstalk skit before facing an actual giant on stage. That was the product McMahon was building. The financial terms were substantial. Gary Stridham, who became the WBF's first and only champion, was reportedly signed to a contract worth $400,000 per year. At the WBF's launch press conference at the Plaza Hotel in New York on January 30th, 1991, 13 athletes designated as body stars were signed. Recruitment was ongoing. McMahon and Platz were targeting the athletes who were winning, or who appeared positioned to start winning. The man who had appeared without announcement at the 1990 Night of Champions and placed second was on their list. Tom Platz arranged for Dorian Yates to travel to Titan Sports' headquarters in Connecticut. There was a facility tour. There were meetings, including with executives close to McMahon. Then came the offer. Depending on the source, the figure was either $170,000 or as high as $200,000 per year. For a man living in Ladywood with no endorsement income and a family relying on his next decision, that number was significant. It was the kind of money that doesn't simply improve a year. It restructures a life. A house becomes possible. Financial pressure eases. The basic calculations change. Yates boarded a plane and flew home. The return flight is where the decision actually formed. Sitting somewhere over the Atlantic, alone with the offer and his own assessment of it, something about it didn't resolve cleanly in his mind. He got home and sat down with Debbie. He went through everything, the number, what it would mean for housing, for the things they could afford, for the things they could stop worrying about. Debbie's response was straightforward. She told him the decision was entirely his to make. She wasn't going to direct it. It was on him. So he considered it. What he kept returning to was the feeling, not the logic. The logic said take the money. He was broke. The sport owed him nothing. And financial security was real. But the feeling pointed in a different direction. Years later, he described it as a bad gut feeling about the Wrestling Federation. He didn't like what the WBF was. He didn't want to be an entertainer built around a gimmick persona. And he didn't want to leave a system that had a specific achievement at its summit, an achievement that had been at the center of his ambitions since he first stepped into a gym. The Mr. Olympia. Every serious bodybuilder in the world understood what that title meant. It was the singular proof that you were the best bodybuilder alive. To join the WBF, he would have had to leave the IFBB, which meant leaving the Olympia entirely. The question he was really asking himself wasn't whether he wanted $170,000. The question was whether he believed in himself enough to turn down that money and trust that the Olympia was within reach. The answer required a kind of courage that's difficult to articulate. He was broke, he had a son, he had a wife who, to her immense credit, placed the full weight of the decision on his shoulders, and he said no. The contract went unsigned. Dorian Yates stayed with the IFBB, stayed in Birmingham, and returned to the gym. What he didn't yet know was that he had just made the most consequential decision of his career. The WBF held its inaugural championship on June 15, 1991, at Donald Trump's Taj Mahal in Atlantic City. Broadcast on pay-per-view, the production was polished. Regis Philbin hosted, Bobby the Brain Heenan provided commentary, the entrance videos were slick, and the wrestling-style presentation was unmistakable. The reception was mixed. Bodybuilding purists objected to the entertainment rounds. Casual viewers were uncertain what they were watching. And the hardcore wrestling audience largely wasn't persuaded that men in posing trunks offered the same kind of entertainment as a Royal Rumble. The more serious problem arrived shortly after. 12 days after the WBF's inaugural event, a federal case reshaped the landscape. Dr. George Zahorian, a ringside physician for the WWF who had been supplying anabolic steroids to wrestlers and other athletes, was found guilty on 12 of 14 charges. The scrutiny on McMahon's organizations, both of them, intensified sharply. The government's attention followed. Under mounting pressure, the WBF announced in March 1992 that it would introduce drug testing before its second championship. The athletes who had been recruited to be massive and extraordinary, who had been competing in the IFBB with full pharmaceutical support, now had to discontinue that support with only months of notice before a pay-per-view event. The 1992 WBF Championship in Long Beach was by most accounts a failure. The athletes were noticeably smaller and less conditioned than they had been the year before. Lou Ferrigno, the Incredible Hulk himself, the marquee signing McMahon had hoped would bring mainstream crossover appeal, left the WBF and competed at the Mr. Olympia instead. Lex Luger, who was scheduled for a guest appearance, was injured in a motorcycle accident and couldn't participate. The pay-per-view generated approximately 3,000 buys. For context, the WWF's major events were drawing hundreds of thousands of buys during the same period. On July 15, 1992, Vince McMahon personally called Ben and Joe Weider, the founders of the IFBB, the men the WBF had been built to displace, and told them the organization was finished. He asked them to allow the WBF athletes to return to the IFBB. The Weiders agreed on two conditions. Each returning athlete would pay a $25,000 fine, and the Weiders would determine how they were reintroduced. On May 22, 1993, at the IFBB Night of Champions in Manhattan, the stage was set with 13 tombstones, each one engraved with the name of a WBF athlete. Then Dorian Yates walked out, dressed as a preacher. He stood at the center of the stage, surrounded by the tombstones of the men who had taken the money and signed the contracts. One by one, the WBF athletes climbed out of makeshift coffins and destroyed their own tombstones. Dorian Yates, the man who had been offered the deal, who had been the target, who had been broke in Birmingham when Tom Platz flew him to Connecticut, was the one standing on that stage in a preacher's robe, presiding over the return of the defectors. He hadn't followed them into the coffin. He had been on the stage the entire time. While the WBF was collapsing, Yates was building something that hadn't quite existed in bodybuilding before. He returned to the Night of Champions in May 1991, the same show where he had drawn attention the year before. 7 pounds heavier, with improvements to his back development that observers said seemed to defy genetics. He was no longer simply being watched. He was being discussed differently. His back was drawing comparisons to Lee Haney, the reigning Mr. Olympia champion who had already won the title 8 times. By that point, the trajectory was no longer in question. In 1992, Dorian Yates stepped onto the Mr. Olympia stage for the second time. He came in at 242 pounds, lean, densely conditioned, combining size and definition, at a level the sport had not previously seen. He won. When the result was announced and his hand was raised, Yates punched the air, one of the most uncharacteristically demonstrative moments from a man who otherwise conducted himself in near-total silence. The following day, he flew home to England and won the English Grand Prix in Nottingham, in front of 2,000 people from his own city. That was the measure of him. He won the sport's most prestigious title, and competed again the next day, on home soil, because that was what the schedule required. He would not lose another professional competition for the remainder of his career. What Yates brought to bodybuilding was genuinely new. Before him, the sport's top competitors were sculpted in the classical sense, symmetrical, proportional, shaped according to an aesthetic standard that had defined the discipline since Arnold Schwarzenegger's era. Yates changed what the sport rewarded. He was large, but he was also conditioned to a degree that had not been seen at that size. His physique looked categorically different from the men standing beside him on stage. He trained using high-intensity training, a philosophy influenced by Arthur Jones and Mike Mensa, which rejected the high-volume approach most competitors followed. Where other bodybuilders performed 20, 30, or 40 sets per muscle group, Yates performed 1 or 2. Those sets, however, were taken so far beyond ordinary thresholds of effort that any direct comparison became meaningless. He trained 4 days a week. Each session was short, intensive, and total. Temple Gym was not a place for partial commitment, the full-on. He won in 93, he won in 94, in 95, 96, and 97, he kept winning. 6 consecutive Sandow trophies, bodybuilding's ultimate prize awarded to the same man, from the same city, training in the same gym, following the same philosophy. The injuries accumulated along the way. He tore his biceps. He tore his triceps, the latter occurring 3 weeks before the 1997 Mr. Olympia, his final contest. He competed regardless. He won regardless. That final contest generated controversy. Many observers believed runner-up Nasser El Sombedi had presented the superior physique that day. The scorecards read Yates. He walked away from competition in 1997, having gone undefeated in every show he entered since 1992. His professional record stands at 15 major contest victories and 2 second-place finishes. He was inducted into the IFBB Hall of Fame in 2003. Every title, every win, every part of that record traced back to a decision made in a Birmingham flat in 1991, when he looked at a contract worth $170,000 a year and concluded he was worth more than what it offered. The temptation is to frame that decision as instinct, gut feeling over money, clean outcome, end of story. But the more you examine who Dorian Yates actually is, the clearer it becomes that the decision was not impulsive. It came from somewhere specific. A set of values that had been forming since he was 19 years old in a youth detention center, standing in front of a barbell and determining what his life was going to be. Yates has said on more than one occasion that when he started bodybuilding, his motivations had nothing to do with money, recognition, or status. He started because it made him feel good, because he had found something that returned exactly what he put into it. There was no luck involved, no politics, no favoritism. You lifted heavier, ate better, recovered properly, and you grew. The relationship between effort and outcome was direct and consistent in a way the world outside the gym rarely was. That foundation, the understanding of bodybuilding as a personal pursuit before it was a career, meant that when a substantial financial offer was placed in front of him, attached to conditions that required him to treat the sport as entertainment rather than competition, he rejected it. The WBF was not simply a different organization. It represented a different understanding of what bodybuilding was for. He had written down his goals. He had mapped the path to the Olympia the way a soldier maps an objective. The WBF offer, whatever its financial appeal, was not on that map. It was a detour, well-funded, comfortable, and leading somewhere he had never intended to go. His training philosophy reflected the same logic. While most of the bodybuilding world was running marathon sessions 3 hours in the gym, set after set, Yates was doing the opposite. He reduced everything to its essential core. He identified the minimum effective dose, the precise amount of stimulus needed to produce maximum growth, and nothing beyond that. Every set had to justify its place in the session. Everything else was removed. That is not only a training philosophy. It is a philosophy for how to allocate effort, applied, in this case, to a weight belt. The man who refused to waste a single set in the gym was always going to refuse a contract that required him to misallocate the one career he had built with purpose. There is a further dimension to this when viewed against the sport's broader response to the WBF. The IFBB, under financial pressure from Vince McMahon's organization, raised the Olympia prize money to $100,000 for 1991, a direct response to the competition. The athletes who remained with the IFBB competed for better terms as a result. By declining the WBF offer, Yates and others who stayed helped force the established organization to value its competitors more. The decision protected his own trajectory and contributed to an outcome that benefited the athletes who followed. More than 30 years after the WBF offer, Dorian Yates launched a podcast called Shadow Talk, a natural extension of the approach he had always taken. He had worked in silence, let the results speak, and spoken when he had something worth saying. For the inaugural episode, he invited Tom Platz. The conversation that followed was one of the most candid exchanges either man had put on record. Yates opened without hesitation. No careful diplomacy, no easing in. He told Platz directly, "You were my hero, man." Then he told a story he said he'd been telling for years. When Dorian Yates was young, before the titles and the fame, he idolized Tom Platz. Platz represented everything: the legs, the intensity, the passion. He was what bodybuilding looked like when someone gave everything they had. The first time Yates met him, this enormous moment, a meeting with his idol, produced a single syllable. He said hi. That was it. Platz apparently said little more. Two people, each absorbed in their own heads, standing next to a legend and not knowing what to do with it. The story is funny and human. It also says something about where Yates was, psychologically, during those years. He was a man with massive ambition and very little self-promotion. He worshipped quietly. He competed quietly. He trained behind closed doors. And then he showed up and destroyed everyone. On the podcast, the two men discussed the WBF period openly. Yates walked through the full sequence: the flight to Connecticut, the tour, the offer, the drive home, the conversation with Debbie, and the gut feeling that ultimately made the decision. He was clear. It was never about disrespecting Tom Platz. Platz was doing a job, representing an organization he believed in, trying to recruit an athlete he had correctly identified as being on the verge of something significant. The refusal was about Dorian Yates trusting Dorian Yates. The conversation extended beyond the WBF. Both men had complicated views on what the sport has become. Yates noted that when he speaks with young bodybuilders today, the first thing they ask about is compounds and cycles, not training methods, not periodization, not the philosophy of progressive overload, or the mental approach to preparation. The drugs come first. Platz agreed, and added that in the golden era, the emphasis was on the love of the craft. The sport came first, the enhancements were secondary. They discussed health and longevity. Yates talked about the cardiovascular toll that extreme size takes on the body as it ages. A doctor had explained to him that carrying excess body weight, whether muscle or fat, stresses the heart in ways that compound over time. He spoke about the value of mobility, of practicing yoga, of being able to do things outside the gym. Being smaller, he said, is kind of fun. Platz laughed and noted that the men he trained with were horrified when he expressed the same thing. Two men who had spent the prime of their lives being as large as humanly possible, sitting together in their 60s and discussing the satisfaction of no longer being that large. The conversation returned, as it had to the WBF. What Yates confirmed, the moment the video's title refers to, was not dramatic on the surface. It was the absence of drama that made it notable. He was not bitter about the offer. He held no resentment toward Platz for making it. He did not frame it as an attempt to derail his career. He framed it as what it was, a business offer from an organization that turned out to be a bad bet, made by a man he had idolized since adolescence. He said no, because he believed in himself and believed in the Olympia. Simple, direct, no embellishment, which for anyone familiar with who Dorian Yates actually is exactly what you would have expected.